Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gadi Schwartz coming to you from Los Angeles. And here's some of the stories we're watching tonight.
We just want to work. We want to do things right.
With Title 42 now a thing of the past, will court decisions and legal challenges decide the future of this country's immigration policy? Then in Idaho.
Is Lori Maureen Vallow not guilty or guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder of Kylie Ryan and grand theft by deception? Answer, guilty.
That was the moment Lori Vallow found out she was guilty of murdering her 2 children and conspiring to kill her husband's first wife. And the Marine who put a New York subway rider into a fatal chokehold surrenders to police.
He could have chose to let him go, but he didn't.
And tonight, along the U.S.-Mexico border, what appears to be a drop in the number of migrants trying to cross into the United States, at least a temporary one, as Title 42 has now been lifted. In Mexico, there are still estimates that tens of thousands of migrants are waiting to cross into the U.S. But all along the border, a show of force from the Biden administration, as well as Republican-directed state law enforcement, despite huge partisan differences when it comes to immigration policy. The full impact of all of this still unfolding, but for now, the number of migrants crossing appeared to crescendo at over 11,000 daily apprehensions earlier in the week. My colleague Jose Diaz-Balart spoke to a migrant family from Venezuela about why they made the journey.
Right now, we just fulfilled one of our dreams to come to the United States and to enter the United States, and we're trying to get to Chicago to work and to establish our lives there. We want our children to start studying there, to prepare themselves. So to buy a little house, we don't have a house in Venezuela. We don't have anything. The little that we had, we sold so we could try to come to the United States.
Now, some of the images that captured the humanitarian toll of this crisis, that one right there, an infant in a suitcase floating across the Rio Grande to get to the United States, hundreds turned back by barbed wire. Meanwhile, in Florida, an unaccompanied teen died in a holding facility. His name was Eduardo Maradiaga Espinosa, and he was 17 years old. The cause of his death is still under investigation. NBC News correspondent Guad Venegas joins us now from the San Diego border. Guad, first off, what can you tell us about the teen that died in that shelter?
Gadi, we know that he had been turned over to Health and Human Services on May 5th, and 5 days later, on May 10th, he died. The Department of Health and Human Services has issued a statement saying that the medical examiner is investigating the situation. Now, the way the process works with migrants that arrive at the border, as we know, they are first processed by Customs and Border Protection for unaccompanied minors, like in this case. Many of them are then, after they are released from these processing centers, are turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services. They have these shelters that sometimes work with organizations, NGOs, that work with that department. So we have to figure out more or find out more details from this investigation as what could have happened between May 5th and May 10th when this minor died in a hospital, Gadi. And I should add that in the last few days that we've been here, we've seen a number of people who arrived sick or who got sick when they were waiting. So the migrants that travel, some through land or some have been in Mexico, but a lot of the ones that arrive at the border here have multiple health problems, whether it's infections or stomach issues or wounds that haven't been treated properly. So they suffer from a lot of health issues that have to be looked at. In fact, I spoke with a doctor, Gadi, in Tijuana, who treats a lot of the migrants, that told me that even the mental health issues that they're suffering because of the trauma they experienced during this trip, and that could also trigger other health issues, physical issues that might take place after they've gone through this mental trauma. So lots of health issues that have to be looked at when it comes to these migrants that arrive in the U.S. And of course, once again, we would have to wait for the results of that investigation that the Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services has announced to find out more details, Gadi.
And Guad, we keep hearing about the 10,000 people a day, 11,000 people apprehended a day, and then today happened. Do we have any sense of how much the numbers have shifted, and is what we're seeing today possibly the calm before a storm?
Well, Gadi, we get these numbers from government officials, right? So what we see is the migrants that arrive at the border. And we see Border Patrol agents take the migrants for processing here, as in Texas and other parts. But we haven't been allowed to go inside these processing centers to see these numbers. So what I can tell you is that the surge or the influx of migrants began a week ago, and every day we've seen more migrants. We didn't see a change after Title 42 was lifted. I mean, I can tell you today there's more families here, there's more women and children. That could be a coincidence, but the numbers haven't really changed when it comes to the migrants that are arriving at the border. Border Patrol and CBP have told us that they're trying to process migrants as fast as possible. Those that are allowed to remain in the U.S. while seeking asylum have to go to the shelters. And we do know, Gadi, from speaking to some of the shelters here in San Diego, that those shelters are almost at capacity. And it's very important for these shelters to be able to help the migrants that are released in the U.S. while they seek asylum, because essentially they are the only ones that can give them a place to sleep and help them get to their destination. Here's part of the conversation that I had with the CEO of Catholic Charities earlier today.
If entities like Catholic Charities and the state of California are not taking care of them, they are now going to end up on the streets of Southern California. Then, when they're there, they're going to become homeless. They're going to have other issues. We have to cure that.
Now, when it comes to numbers, Gadi, here in San Diego, Catholic Charities is just one of the charities that has shelters. They have 3 out of 8 that operate in the area. Now, they were seeing numbers of 300 to maybe 700 on a normal basis throughout the last 2 years. But they told me that they saw 1,000 yesterday, and today 1,200 migrants get released into their care. So the numbers are escalating. They're hoping that they stay there. They still have some capacity, but they're almost at capacity at Catholic Charities, Gadi.
And Gadi, now that Title 42 has been lifted, what's the process like for people in Mexico right now trying to get to the United States and claim asylum?
Well, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas said that under the new immigration policy, individuals that arrive at the U.S. border and do not use a lawful pathway will not be eligible for asylum. So these are the individuals that we see in the camp here in other parts, right? So essentially, DHS Secretary Mayorkas is saying the migrants need to use that app, CBP One app, to go to a port of entry and request asylum that way. They will no longer be granted asylum to remain in the U.S. if they arrive the way they've arrived here. So we'll have to see how CBP moves forward with this new immigration policy when they process a lot of these migrants, because under these new rules, essentially all of the ones that are camped out here would not qualify. So, you know, we'll see how these next few days go and the number of migrants that are released in the U.S. under that asylum-seeking process. Gadi.
Gadi Venegas, thanks so much, brother. And communities across the country are finding themselves housing more migrants, but a lot of the shelters helping out are starting to hit capacity. There are churches, police stations, and schools opening doors to shelter people of all ages. Meanwhile, some state and federal facilities are also filling up, and the Biden administration began releasing migrants into the U.S. after they had been vetted without a way to track them. But last night, shortly before Title 42 ended, a Florida judge temporarily blocked that plan, and Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas fired back with this.
The majority of individuals will be removed. When a Border Patrol facility is overcrowded, we screen and vet the individuals in our custody, and then we release them for them to go into immigration enforcement proceedings. And the Department of Justice is considering its options.
This isn't the only legal hurdle facing the Biden administration. Also last night, the ACLU also filed a lawsuit saying asylum rights are not being respected. NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos is here to help explain all of this. Danny, let's start with this Florida judge's decision. How is that going to impact immigration policy post Title 42?
It's hard to say. I mean, this has become a procedural mess. It was a procedural mess before the judge issued the order because you have a federal statute that requires requires screening. It doesn't require that everybody who comes to this country be admitted automatically and given asylum. What federal law requires, and what Title 42 was a kind of workaround, is that everyone who comes to the border must be screened for asylum. They must be entitled to that hearing. The Title 42 was an effort by the Trump administration to use a workaround based on the COVID-19 pandemic to turn those people away. And what's strange is that it was effectively continued by the Biden administration, although the Biden administration says it has more outs or more options. It still is effectively the same policy. So procedurally, this has now become a mess upon top of a mess.
And the ACLU is also suing the Biden administration. So a mess on a mess on a mess. Are we going to see more lawsuits like this?
Yes, and in fact, the ACLU not too long ago sued during the Trump administration on a similar basis. So the ACLU is essentially arguing what I just said, which is that Title 42 must be vacated because it is something that essentially violates the federal law. Congress has said, and Congress is crystal clear on this issue. Congress has said that when you come to the border, you must be screened. And any workaround that prevents that is a violation of federal law. It's a lawsuit that's likely to prevail. But the reality is we just don't know what the contours are going to be of whatever is remaining of Title 42 after today and in the coming weeks.
Danny Ceballos, thanks so much. Meanwhile, Daniel Penny, a former Marine seen in a video putting Jordan Neely in a deadly chokehold aboard a New York subway, surrendered to police today. Penny has been charged with second-degree manslaughter, and tonight he's out on a $100,000 bond. Neely's family and attorneys held a press conference after the arraignment.
We knew that justice would not be swift. We realized that justice was going to be a journey. And so today we want to not stop, because we're not going to stop until we get full justice.
Today, in a statement, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg said his investigation has included witness interviews and careful review of the footage, adding that Jordan Neely should still be alive today. Meanwhile, Penny's lawyers say their client never intended to harm Neely and could not have foreseen his death. They pointed to Neely's, quote, documented history of violent and erratic behavior, and that Penny risked his life and safety for the good of his fellow passengers. NBC's Rahima Ellis has more.
Gadi, Daniel Penny entered the Manhattan criminal courthouse behind me earlier today to face charges that the family of Jordan Neely and demonstrators had been demanding. The 24-year-old former Marine entered the courtroom wearing handcuffs to face the charges of second-degree manslaughter. If convicted, he could face a maximum of 15 years in prison. Bail was set at $100,000. His parents guaranteed the bond. He surrendered his passport and was told that he could not leave the city without approval. His attorney says his client is innocent of the charges and he never intended to hurt Jordan Neely.
He's dealing with the situation, like I said, with the sort of integrity and honor that is characteristic of who he is, characteristic of his honorable service in the United States Marine Corps. And, you know, he has his head held up high.
But for the family of Jordan Neely, they say that means very little. They wanted more care to be done so that this tragedy never happened.
Daniel Penny intentionally chose a technique to use that is designed to cut off air. That's what he chose. That's a choice that he made, and he did it intentionally. So we believe that the conviction should be for murder because that's intentional.
Daniel Penny is due back in court the middle of July. Meanwhile, next week, Mayor Adams plans to bring together leaders of homeless outreach services to talk about what might be done to help those who are homeless and in crisis as they're mentally ill. Gadi?
Rahima Ellis, thanks so much. It's a true crime case that at times seemed too bizarre to be real. A so-called doomsday mom who claimed to have special powers and talked about zombies and teleportation has been found guilty of killing her 2 children. Now, Vallow, motionless as the verdict was being read. She was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. Vallow's 2 youngest kids, JJ and Tylee, disappeared in 2019. Months later, police found their body on a property that belonged to their stepfather, Vallow's 5th husband, and alleged cult leader Chad Daybell. He is also facing his own set of murder charges. NBC Dana Griffith joins us now in the studio. Dana, today's verdict, was that a surprise? Was that a foregone conclusion? And what's the sentencing looking like here?
So not surprising at all. The one thing that we were kind of curious about was the conspiracy to commit murder for Tammy Daybell, because jurors could have maybe had questions that could have been hung there. But there was such overwhelming evidence in this case that it makes sense why they came back fairly quickly. Last night, we actually thought we were going to get a verdict because they actually took a dinner break, then went back to deliberating. They adjourned, came back just 3 hours, and as you saw, we got that verdict, guilty on all charges.
Now, the circumstances surrounding the death of her 2 kids is just horrifying.
Yeah.
And this is a very large family. How's the rest of the family reacting?
So JJ's grandfather, Larry Woodcock, after that verdict was read, he came out of the courthouse, his fist in the air, along with Kay Woodcock, his grandmother, and the crowd started singing Queen's "We Will Rock You," and that's JJ's favorite song. Larry would actually play that on his iPad as he walked into the courthouse. So it was kind of like a rallying cry for everyone that has watched this trial over the last 5 weeks. And he talked about, he thanked the jurors, saying he wanted to hug them. He thanked law enforcement for their diligence in this case and the fact that they had to sit there and see things that will probably haunt them for the rest of their lives. He also talked about Lori and had a message for her and pretty much says, like, the end is here. Here's what else he had to say. Listen.
I hope nobody ever has to see and hear the details of what happened to JJ, to Tylee, and to Tammy.
So very emotional there. He also talked about how he is excited to see Chad Daybell in court when his trial comes up.
Yeah, it's so difficult to hear that and know that those details are likely to come up when Chad goes to trial. What's this verdict going to do to that case?
Well, it's very telling because in court we heard for the first time some very incriminating evidence, including that Tylee Ryan's DNA was found on a pickaxe and a shovel inside Chad Daybell's shed. And, I mean, obviously, their bodies were found buried on his property. So he's got a lot of questions to answer. And it now makes me wonder, what is his defense thinking about? Are they going to try to settle so that he can avoid that death penalty? Lori escaped it only because of a technicality, because the prosecution didn't present the evidence to the defense in enough time. That's the only reason why she is facing life in prison right now.
Such disturbing details. Dana, thanks so much for joining us. And June is going to be here before we know it, and lawmakers still don't seem to be making much progress on a massive budget fix. Right now, the country is barreling towards a $31 trillion budget wall that we know as our debt ceiling. And even though the president and top Republican lawmakers were supposed to be meeting today to figure out a way to prevent the crisis, that meeting was postponed. NBC's Peter Alexander has more.
Gadi, that deadline to avoid a catastrophic default is now potentially less than 3 weeks away, and there is no new date set for any meeting between President Biden and congressional leaders, including the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, though it is likely to happen early next week. And tonight I'm told that staff for both the president and those leaders will meet again both Saturday and Sunday as they keep trying to hash out to make progress toward resolving this crisis. McCarthy said the decision to postpone the meeting initially scheduled for today was agreed to by everybody. The White House says that they are making some ground here, but the clock is ticking, and the president, he's scheduled to travel to Japan for the G7 summit next week. He'll have a short stop in Australia afterward. Of course, he can still work on this from there, but there is a lot of ground to cover. House Republicans, as we've been reporting, they recently passed legislation that would lift the debt ceiling only if the White House will agree to spending cuts. The president says the debt ceiling, effectively the nation's credit card, needs to be raised without conditions. a default would have serious implications for tens of millions of Americans, particularly for those retirees, those who are disabled, children as well, anyone who receives Social Security benefits. If the U.S. defaults on its obligations, experts warn that those Social Security recipients could see their checks delayed. All of that uncertainty only underscoring the stakes of this urgent situation. Gadi?
Peter Alexander, thanks so much. Still ahead this hour, maybe you remember a certain YouTuber who jumped out of his plane over California saying he had engine problems. But did he really?
I'm just so happy to be alive. I'm just kind of taking in what just happened. Well, where the hell am I going to land a freaking plane? I'm going to die. That's why I always freaking fly with a parachute.
Always fly with a parachute? Well, plot twist. The influencer is pleading guilty to crashing it on purpose for the views, admitting he staged the whole thing. At Insane Stories coming up next. And here are some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. A Border Patrol agent is accused of trying to smuggle drugs and a person across the border. Undercover agents arrested Hector Hernandez after they say he accepted thousands of dollars to help move meth as well as an undocumented immigrant over the border near San Diego. And a former NBC Universal executive will be the next person in charge of Twitter. Elon Musk introduced Linda Yaccarino in a tweet this morning. Now, Yaccarino has worked at NBC Universal, the parent company of NBC News, for the last 12 years, and Musk says he will now focus on product design and new technology and his other companies like Tesla. And Jamie Foxx is out of the hospital and recovering following some sort of health scare. Fox's daughter announcing the update on Instagram following what looked like false reports that his condition was getting worse. Foxx was hospitalized a month ago following a medical complication. And United Airline pilots are picketing across the country ahead of a busy summer travel season. Organizers say they haven't gotten a raise in about 4 years while they've been negotiating a new contract. And United could be the next airline union to vote to authorize a strike following American and Southwest pilots. And big news in the world of video games. The latest installment of Zelda is out. It's called The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. It is getting some good reviews, crazy good reviews, and it apparently helps if you know a little bit about chemistry and physics, so start crafting. And have you ever heard someone ask, why would anyone jump out of a perfectly good plane? Well, when it comes to this next story, apparently the answer has to do with YouTube clicks. YouTuber Trevor Jacob has now admitted that he purposefully crashed that plane into a California mountain for the views and is expected to plead guilty for obstructing a federal investigation into that plane crash. Now, the video showing that whole saga got over 3 million views, but it could also carry a sentence of up to 20 years behind bars.
It was a sensational moment. A propeller stops in midair. Holy. Then this awkward dive out. Then a plane crash suspiciously caught on camera from several angles. But this crash was apparently no accident. According to federal authorities, the pilot, 29-year-old Trevor Daniel Jacob, has agreed to plead guilty to a felony charge. They say he staged the whole thing for the sake of making a YouTube video that's racked up more than 3 million views.
I guess I should probably document what's going on. I cut my finger pretty bad, got my elbow. I'm just so happy to be alive.
But even shortly after he posted the video back in 2021, some online started pointing out a few things that seemed amiss. First, in the YouTube video, he never appears to call for help. Second, it shows his door was already open before the engine stopped. And third, it seems like Jacob was wearing a parachute and grabbed his selfie stick. On the ground?
I see it down there. Thank you, God. Thank you, universe. Thank you, higher power, for watching over me.
Investigators say he also lied to them about not knowing where the plane crashed and went back again later to get rid of the wreckage. The U.S. attorney saying it was all motivated by a sponsorship deal to promote a company's wallet.
I'm in pain, man. I'm hurting. Whatever I'm going through, I wish upon nobody.
Another crazy part of that story, investigators say he actually went back to get that wreckage with a helicopter, brought it back to an airport, and chopped it up into little pieces small enough to put in trash cans. Well, Next story, where is the first place people go when they want to post the most controversial takes or express their intent to get violent? The internet, of course, but it's not always the dark web. A lot of times it comes in the forms of memes, and NBC's Ken Delanian has more.
The patch worn by the mass shooter who took 8 lives at a Texas mall last week meant nothing to most people. But the acronym RWDS, for Right-Wing Death Squad, has for years been a popular meme in far-right circles. It's the latest example of how experts say violent extremists are using memes to fuel radicalization.
It's like grassroots organizing, and that you feel like you're really involved, but it's also at scale, and that's what a meme can do. And they spread like wildfire.
The U.S. National Counterterrorism Center recently warned in an intelligence bulletin that memes are full of coded language that makes it harder for social media platforms to flag them as extremist content.
The intent is to hide these provocative and extremist messaging under a veil of irony to avert detection.
Memes have been a feature of hate-motivated violence for years. The man sentenced to life in prison for killing 10 people at a Buffalo supermarket last year plastered his gun with racist slogans. In the winter of 2020, Aaron Swenson posted these crude anti-police memes on Facebook. A few months later, Swenson, a self-described member of the far-right extremist group, the Boogaloo Boys, started a Facebook live stream capturing what he said was a mission to hunt and kill a police officer. Prosecutors say this is the moment he tried to ambush a Texas patrolman. He ultimately was sentenced to more than 50 years in prison for attempted murder.
We can see how these things that appear innocuous as phony sequel jokes, as meme cartoons, they can really rapidly and dangerously convert into real-world violence.
After both Facebook and Twitter cracked down on extremist users following the January 6th attack, experts say many groups have flocked to more loosely moderated platforms such as Gab, Telegram, and Discord, where Airman Jack Teixeira is accused of posting classified documents.
I think these gaming sites have really come into the fore in public notice as a way for people to be radicalized and then organized, unfortunately.
But law enforcement faces the twin challenges of anonymity and free speech protections. A lot of extremist content is posted under pseudonyms, and the FBI has been reluctant to monitor public social media posts by Americans.
I don't think we've taken this homegrown extremism seriously enough, and we've been very hesitant. And of course, we need to protect the First Amendment, respect the First Amendment, but we also have to take extremism seriously.
Ken Delanian, thank you. Coming up in California, a 25-year-old cold case is back open with some promising leads. That's coming up next. Welcome back. Let's get you caught up in 30 seconds. Today, a jury found Lori Vallow guilty of killing her 2 kids and conspiring to kill her husband's ex-wife. Her husband, Chad Daybell, is also being tried separately. And Daniel Penny turned himself into police for a second-degree manslaughter charge. He's accused of putting Jordan Neely in a fatal chokehold on a New York City subway. And YouTuber Trevor Jacob could be pleading guilty to deliberately crashing a plane. He apparently staged that whole thing for a sponsorship deal. And now that Title 42 has ended, fear and confusion is hitting border towns like El Paso, Texas, because as more and more migrants pour into the city, officials are afraid that the shelters housing migrants now might hit a breaking point. NBC's Julia Ainsley got a rare peek inside one of those shelters. Julia?
It's just hours after Title 42 lifted. We see migrants living on El Paso streets outside shelters. By 7 a.m., we arrive at the Opportunity Center, where families are asleep on the floor.
All of a sudden, we're full.
It's one of 3 shelters run by John Martin, offering migrant families food, housing, a place to take a shower.
We're actually over capacity at this point.
Could there be some people sleeping outside the shelters?
I hope not, but that possibility always exists.
It's about 10 o'clock here inside the shelter, and John says he expects more families to be coming later today. You can see over here, many of them are still sleeping with their belongings pushed against the wall. Families like Robert, Yascari, and their 4-year-old son, Jason, from Venezuela. They tell us they've been here for 8 days. You've been sleeping on this floor for 8 days? They say they are desperate. Back home, they couldn't afford food for their family.
So many migrants fleeing political upheaval, gang violence, or even droughts, looking for a new life in the U.S. Like Jonathan, who also came from Venezuela.
Are you happy that you made it to the United States?
Sí, bastante porque... Yes, it was a huge sacrifice, crossing jungles, many countries. It wasn't easy, he tells us. Meanwhile, by 1 p.m., Martin arrives at another of his shelters.
Currently, we simply have no space inside the building.
Nearby, we meet El Paso residents who say it's just too much, worried their city is overwhelmed.
You see them all in the sidewalks everywhere, all around it, all the block. And it's unsafe for them, it's unsafe for the people.
Tonight, Martin is getting ready. He's heard Border Patrol may drop off more migrants soon.
Julie Ainsley, thanks so much. And for months, border states have been busing migrants to other cities, sometimes thousands of miles away. Today, more arrived in New York City, and New York's governor has declared a state of emergency, which is supposed to give cities more power to handle new arrivals. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the mayor has also issued an emergency declaration. She says about 8,000 migrants have been bused or flown to the city in 2 weeks. For community organizers, space and resources were hard to come by even before migrants started arriving.
Chicago, being a sanctuary city, has really stood up and tried to do its best. But we have a city that doesn't have an infrastructure already to support people that are chronically homeless or adequately. And so that makes it very, very hard. These are hard problems that don't take 2 minutes to solve. They're very complex problems.
And NBC's Shaq Brewster has us a look inside one of those shelters helping migrants.
Good evening, Gadi. Well, Chicago is at a breaking point. That's the word that you're hearing from city officials, from volunteers, from organizations on the front line of this crisis who say they want to help, but they just don't have the capacity to help at this point. And they were saying that before Title 42 even expired. Chicago has been receiving about 100 to 200 migrants each day over the past couple of weeks, a total of 8,000 migrants since August, late August, when Texas Governor Greg Abbott started sending them to cities like Chicago. And what you're hearing is that there's simply not enough housing to house everyone, and that they can't scale up quickly enough to do it in a humane way. The warehouse that I'm in, for example, it was a makeshift shelter that was just constructed earlier this week. It is already at capacity. You can see some of the video from inside. You can see how packed it is inside. You see the children inside, more than 23 children at last count in this facility as they try to expand it. And this is one that was built to put pressure off of the police station. In the police station lobby, we have some video from there. You're seeing migrants on the floor at some points, sometimes just with a blanket, not much more than a blanket, as they lay there on the floor. That becomes somewhat of a first stop, an emergency destination for people once they arrive here in Chicago. So people saying they're trying to help. They're trying to receive those donations of food, of shelter, of time, but they don't have the time to scale up to meet the need that's there. One thing you're also seeing is people volunteering their medical assistance. I want you to listen to my conversation with a physician and her fourth-year med student who've been going around to these different shelters and assessing some of the migrants. Listen to the conditions that they've been experiencing.
They have a lot of back pain and other orthopedic issues related to laying on the ground to sleep and also walking for a really long time, diaper ration babies, the colds I mentioned, and then also a lot of fungal infections just from wet conditions.
They're not having a good time right now, and so even little things like over-the-counter cold meds are really helpful when you're sneezing all day, coughing all day, surrounded by a lot of people.
The message that you continue to hear from those on the front lines, the organizations trying to assist this effort, is that they feel like they're going to run out of resources if migrants continue to be sent to Chicago. And that's why Mayor Lori Lightfoot has asked Governor Greg Abbott, Texas governor, to stop sending migrants here, saying that Chicago just can't handle anymore. Greg Abbott, in a letter, responded to Mayor Lightfoot saying that as long as the situation continues to be so dire at the border, this program will continue here. It's drawing a lot of frustration as the situation continues to become worse here in Chicago. Gadi?
Shaq Brewster, thanks so much. Let's head now to the University of Idaho. It has been 6 months since 4 students were stabbed to death in the middle of the night in their own home. And now this school will be honoring their memories at a graduation ceremony tomorrow, as they will all be awarded posthumous degrees. NBC's Steve Patterson is in Idaho with this story.
Well, Gadi, you know as much as me, you spend a lot of time here as well, that, this community, no matter if you go on campus or in town or even a nearby town, there's been a sense of sorrow, a sense of heft here, a lot of anxiety, really since those first the crimes were committed. And even then, after they have somebody in custody, I think that has lingered really on through until this recent trip that I've taken. Here, I think the atmosphere has changed a whole lot with spring, with students now focusing on their finals, looking forward to commencement. But it's been a really tough year, and I think some of that still does linger. And so I think the university is doing this in part to heal. They're going to offer posthumous degrees and certificates to each of the victims. For Maddie and Kaylee, they were set to graduate. One of them should be walking across that stage tomorrow. They will get those posthumous degrees, certificates to Xana and Ethan. Of course, they were undergrads, but still working toward those degrees. So to honor their legacy, they're going to essentially honor them with what they would have earned had they been allowed to be students and safe and happy and continue their lives. There is another student who was also killed in a car accident. That student will be honored and awarded a certificate as well. Meanwhile, we're hearing about a memorial that is being established, a healing garden, and that's really the operative word. They want to give these students a chance to heal, a chance to move on, a chance to feel like they're walking alongside the memory of their classmates as they walk across that stage. We spoke to some students and staff about how they feel about tomorrow. Here's what they told me.
We're going to remember those 4 individuals and remember the legacy they left on, and just kind of take that and move forward.
They worked hard. They studied hard. They deserve to have that work recognized and honored and remembered, for sure.
One thing that's not clear, Gadi, is if the families of those victims will attend the commencement. Obviously, a lot of them are thankful. They've issued statements to say how appreciative they are of the university. But, there's still a lot of pain, of course, for those families. Another thing to report is the latest with the investigation. Koberger expected in court at the end of June. He has now hired a defense attorney that is certified to handle death penalty cases. So we'll just have to see what plays out in court. Last thing is that the home where the murders were committed has been donated to the university by the previous owner to be demolished. We think it's going to happen at the end of this current semester. And they say they just want to do it because they see it as a source of pain for students. So they're just saying, let's knock it down, focus on the achievements of our graduating students. Gadi?
Totally understandable. Steve Patterson, thanks so much. Here in California, FBI agents and local investigators are still looking for a software executive who disappeared more than 25 years ago. Now, they searched the backyard of a Redwood City home using ground-penetrating radar, which is what you're seeing in those aerials. And NBC Bay Area reporter Mariana Favreau has this story.
About a dozen law enforcement officers painstakingly combed through the backyard of this home on Farm Hill Road. They removed bricks, sifted dirt, and used ground-penetrating equipment to try to find evidence in the disappearance of Ilva Hagner more than 2 decades ago.
Her whereabouts are still unknown, so that's part of everything we're up here doing today is trying to get the other agencies to help us bring closure to what's going on.
Records indicate this 3-bedroom house is owned by Tom Pressburger, a NASA computer programmer who was Ilva's boyfriend and questioned by police when she disappeared in 1996. We reached Pressburger by phone today, but he declined to comment. Ilva was 42 and was last seen at her office in Belmont in October of 1996. Police later found her car unlocked with the keys in the ignition at a motel parking lot in San Carlos. In addition to searching this yard, investigators are also combing nearby Stolsaf Park. Neighbors are stunned.
It makes my skin crawl. I mean, I've raised my kids in this area. I'm born and raised. I can't believe that something like that would happen here.
Ilva lived in Palo Alto. We talked with her neighbor and friend who told us while he's glad police are still investigating her disappearance after nearly 27 years, he's not convinced it will provide any closure.
That was NBC Bay Area's Mariana Favreau. Thanks so much. This next one, it's going to make you hungry. For so many of us, food is how we connect and how we learn about other cultures. And it's more than just what's on the plate. Part 1 of Food Truck Fridays is next. We can't wait to share it, so stay tuned. Now, let's head around the world in 80 seconds. Serbia is taking swift action after 2 mass shootings last week stunned the nation and left 17 dead and another 21 hurt. As of yesterday, police say Serbians have handed over nearly 6,000 unregistered weapons, nearly 300,000 rounds of ammunition, and almost 500 explosive devices. This all happened during the first 3 days of a month-long amnesty period intended to crack down on gun violence. And China has announced it is ordering Tesla to recall more than 1 million vehicles because of issues with its acceleration and braking systems. China's market regulator said that defects on certain Tesla models could increase the risk of collisions. China is a big market for Tesla, with revenue there nearing $20 billion last year. And while Republican Congressman George Santos was charged with a bunch of crimes here in the United States yesterday, he's avoided the same fate in Brazil. He signed a non-prosecution agreement with prosecutors over forging 2 stolen checks in 2008. According to Santos's lawyer, he is no longer the subject of any criminal case in Brazil. All right, so I don't know if you guys know this, but food trucks are huge here in LA, and we love a challenge. I am always hungry, and you know what? It's Friday, so maybe we start something, and we call it Food Truck Friday, where we go around, we learn as much as we can about the world around us through the culinary masterpieces known as food trucks. So this Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we decided to start learning as much as we could through different Asian cultures, all by taking a big bite of cuisine. Take a look.
It reminds me of, every time my mom's making food, cooking delicious food for me, and I think of my childhood, of course.
All right, so for this first Food Truck Friday, we are going to stop by a little cafe called the Stop By Cafe. It's Indonesian, LA fusion. I'm trying to make out with this thing. Hey guys, how's it going? How are you? Gadi.
How are you?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
All right, I see what you have on the menu, but I want what you recommend.
Do you want me to name it out, or you want me to make a surprise?
You surprise me.
Justin and his business partner Tom opened a brick-and-mortar restaurant in 2016, but a year later they were looking to change things up, and the Stop By Cafe food truck was born, serving some delicious Indonesian fusion cuisine.
It smells like a spice that I haven't smelled before.
It's lemongrass.
Lemongrass.
Yeah.
Wow. It's spicy. It's got a little zesty twist. It's like Kentucky Fried Chicken, but 10 times better. What does this smell remind you of?
So it reminds me of my childhood. I was born in Jakarta, the capital of the Indonesia. It reminds me of my hometown, with those old delicious street foods.
So it's not just your childhood that's in here, but it's everything you've seen.
Everything, exactly.
So this almost looks like a salad.
It's called sambal tuna.
Okay.
It's a spicy tuna.
Okay.
Sambal is like Indonesian salsa.
Wow.
Whoa!
Wow.
That's spicier than the
that's got a kick.
Lemongrass chicken. We use a lot of spices. We also do coverline leaves and lemongrass. That's very big in Southeast Asia.
So it's a lot of the same staples of Asia.
Correct.
And then a whole lot of lemongrass.
Exactly.
Because I can feel it. I can feel it like right in here. It's that citrus, you know? So much of your family's cooking has influenced your cooking. Has your family tasted your version?
Rendang is a beef stew.
Yep.
Indonesian is very famous. I got the recipe from my mother. And I did it my own. And then one day, my mom came to the truck. She tried my rendang. She said, "Whoa, your rendang is better than mine."
Oh my gosh.
This is called mee goreng. Some people like, what is mee goreng? I say it's chow mein.
Here we go.
All right.
How do you make things taste so different?
Wow. My mom will make this for like every year on my birthday. So when someone's birthday, you need to have noodles. It's meant last long. Because noodles like long, right?
So this is longevity.
Exactly.
What's it like for you, seeing people leave happy?
I try to introduce Indonesian food to the people with my own creation, a little bit twist. When I see they enjoying the meal and they finish all the food, I'm happy.
So that's it right there. Stop By Cafe. If you see them in LA, stop by. And stay tuned next week as we explore another rich Asian cuisine this AAPI month for Korean food. But before we go, the future of everything. And tonight we are talking about the water crisis in the Southwest. There is this free-for-all for water happening right now in Arizona. It is getting extremely messy, and that story is coming up next. And now for our segment, Temperature Check. There is a special type of seaweed right here in Southern California that, if we had enough of it, could be a game changer in fighting climate change. And LX storyteller Greg Bledsoe explains.
It's very, very cool. I still get goosebumps every time I talk about it. My name is Dr. Jennifer Smith. We are here in my laboratory at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So in my lab, we grow the seaweed, a red seaweed known as Asparagopsis taxiformis, and it's very unique. We have bubbling tanks in what we call our nursery. You can see all the red puffballs tumbling around. Seaweeds have been on the planet for millions of years, and they've evolved all kinds of unique chemical compounds.
So what is it that makes this particular seaweed so special? Well, to understand that, first we have to talk a little bit about cows.
They produce a huge amount of methane. They're eating grass most of the day, and so they literally burp out methane throughout the day. We generally think of a cow producing about the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as a car driving about 50 to 60,000 miles per year.
A cow's burp can have that much of an impact on the health of our planet.
Yeah, and you think about it, there's about 1 billion cows on the planet.
And that's where this seaweed comes in, because it turns out if cows eat just a little bit of it, like less than 1% of their daily diet, they produce a lot less methane.
What we saw was just phenomenal. We first started in the lab, and so we were happy with the results in the lab, and then we moved on to real animals.
How are you able to measure like the equivalent of a cow breathalyzer? I mean, how does that work?
That's exactly what it is. As they're eating, they are basically breathing into it. By the end, we saw up to 80% reduction. I mean, this is just phenomenal to me because in all these years that I've done this type of work, I've never seen anything that is nearly as effective as this.
So it worked in the study. What does that mean, though, for the real world? That's why we came here to a dairy farm about an hour north of San Francisco.
Yeah, my father started the dairy in 1941. My name's Albert Strauss. Looking for solutions is what I do. We had a trial that had 24 cows being fed the red seaweed, and we had an average of 52% reduction in enteric methane. We did a blind taste test of the milk, no difference at all. It's really exciting. Farms and animals are actually a solution.
How important is it that the cattle industry do something?
I think it's essential, and I think the state of California is very driven to make these changes.
Yeah, in fact, the state of California has now approved that seaweed to be used in cattle feed. But there's still one huge challenge.
The catch is that we now need to figure out how to grow enough of this seaweed to feed the 1 billion cattle on the planet. It's a complicated seaweed, it's delicate, it's finicky, so there's a lot of things that need to be worked out in order to think about having a massive commercial scale aquaculture industry for the species.
But it works.
It works, and the good thing about methane is that it only sticks around in the atmosphere for about 12 years. So that means that if we can do something to get a handle on methane emissions now in our lifetime, we'll be able to see those impacts. I mean, it's definitely, in my mind, it is the lowest hanging fruit for solving methane emissions in the world.
All right, so now we go from the ocean, where there is a lot of water, to the future of water. Right now, there is an underground battle that is happening. It's cracking open the earth in the Southwest, and Brad Hicks reports from Arizona, where there's a struggle between communities and corporation over water.
Steve and Lucia Kissel have a sinking feeling.
It caught us off guard.
The earth around them is opening up and the ground is getting lower.
You can put two and two together as to who's causing this.
The problem started 10 years ago. Out-of-state companies began buying huge amounts of farmland in Cochise County. Nut growers from California, a massive dairy out of Minnesota. They drilled deep wells, deeper than local folks could ever afford, and started draining the aquifer for their thirsty trees and forage crops. Steve Kissel's well has been going down ever since.
It's been dropping between 5 and 5.5 feet a year.
As the water table drops, so does the land above it. But lawmakers have been unable to stop it. In rural Arizona, groundwater is a free-for-all.
Someone can drill a well, pump as much water as they want, and there's no restrictions.
So the citizens had to do something.
A petition, the first in Arizona to let voters decide whether to limit water use. Cochise County has 2 groundwater basins. In one, voters approved requiring big growers report how much water they use and a freeze on new farms. In the other, the proposition was defeated 2-1.
Come on, Cal!
Rancher Sonia Gasho led the calls against it. It came down to having local control.
The biggest concern was private property rights and the idea that someone from the government was going to tell you how to farm.
Steve Kissel lives where the proposition lost. Down the road, relics remained from the glory days of gold mining. He worries by mining water, history will repeat itself.
This whole part of the state is going to become a ghost town.
In Cochise County, Arizona, Brad Hicks reporting.
History and the future intertwined there. That does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you here Monday, but until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.